All right, let's go ahead and get started. Yeah, if you don't have it, do get the handout with the first few chapters of the Didache. You'll notice that the chapters are more like big paragraphs than actual chapters. That's not uncommon in a lot of the way that we do our patristic writings. I'm not sure who started that tradition, but we're going with it. But before we get into the text itself, let's do a little bit of introductory notes. The last 2 weeks, we were talking about the relationship between Scripture and tradition and how the tradition of the church and the church fathers are always subject to the Holy Scriptures. We always start with the Scriptures. We do not have volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of authoritative magisterial stuff in the church fathers. Rather, we have our history with them, our great teachings of the past, our great writings of the past, wisdom that we can learn from, but and we should have consistency as much as possible, but they are not infallible, and that's okay. We may see some of that as we get into the Didache. Let's talk some formal introductory notes. The word Didache means the teaching, and the formal title of this document is the teaching of the 12 apostles, or sometimes you'll see the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. This is a very, very early work. This is probably, most scholars think, the earliest post-biblical work we have. So that puts it in the era of what we call the Apostolic Fathers. So there's the Church Fathers as a big picture, and then there's a very specific, smaller category called the Apostolic Fathers. And the Apostolic Fathers are usually that late first century and second century folks who were, if they themselves were not taught by the apostles, they were taught by folks who taught the apostles. So this is basically second and third generation Christianity. So the Didache was most likely written between 80 and 120 AD. My copy of all this comes from, as I mentioned before, a 19th century translation of the Fathers done by some Presbyterians and some Anglicans in England, headed by a guy named Philip Schaff. And this was a period when patristic studies was really coming into its own throughout the world, but especially in the English-speaking world. At the time, this had just been discovered at the time these were written. The Didache was thought lost for centuries. They knew about it because it had been referenced in other writings, but we didn't have a copy of it until one was discovered in 1873, just a few years before this big project of translating the Fathers into English starts. And they're pretty sure the manuscript they found was written in about 1056 or so. So it was a very, at this point, over 800 years old manuscript that they find in this monastery. That's the way it happened a lot of times, by the way. They find something that they thought was lost in some obscure monastery because the monks kept, as a librarian, all of these old texts, and they didn't always know what they had. They didn't have card catalogs, they didn't have microfiche, they didn't have the internet, of course, in those days. So the Didache is written between 80 and 120 AD. One of the reasons why we know that is because of the content of it is very representative of this very early approach to Christianity. The introductory notes in my edition, the editor speaks to its writing style as, it calls it its simplicity almost amounting to childishness. And that was typical of those early writings. What are they meaning? Well, the doctrine and the Christian thought is still pretty undeveloped. We haven't had the major heresies yet, the stuff that leads to the councils. And so we're going to find in these early works, there's some imprecision when we're talking about things like the Trinity and other big theological concepts. We wouldn't say that that imprecision is heresy because it's just imprecision. And why is it imprecise? Well, because the controversies hadn't happened that led to the need for more precise language, right? So that language we get in Nicaea is still a couple hundred years off because Arianism is still a couple hundred years off. You'll find this, by the way, as Protestants, when we're dealing with the doctrine of justification, the fathers are super imprecise because the controversies over what justification really means doesn't show up for 1,000 years. So part of what's happening at the Reformation is the church in different places and working out what that means, what justification means. So when you see, it's the same thing with when it comes to Eucharistic theology, the fathers are super imprecise. They don't always speak in the same terms because the controversies weren't there yet, right? So, but when we come to the Didache, this is like everything theologically is pretty undeveloped. It shows that the thoughts here predate the major heresies, major theological controversies. And what's typical in the age of the Apostolic Fathers is a focus more on ethics than on theology. This is the time of the early persecutions of the church. And so what you do is really the most important thing in terms of differentiating Christianity from paganism. They haven't really got into some of the deeper theological issues. And we see in the Didache in particular, this seems to be one of, at least in its community, wherever it comes from, it's a transition period between Jewish Christianity and Greek or Gentile Christianity. There's a lot more Judaism in this document than you're going to find in later documents. Part of that's because it's not too long after this that the Jewish branch of Christianity basically dies out. It doesn't really survive the Bar Kokhba rebellion in was that 137 or so, when Jerusalem is destroyed again. So this is a transition document. I heard one guy say, well, it almost feels like it's Judaizing or Ebionite heresy. Well, it predates the Ebionite heresy. This is before the Ebionite, so you can't call it Ebionite when it predates what's going on. It's just early. You know, that's what's happening. It's very early. It's at that point of transition. One of the other things you're going to find as we go through this is that there's a variety of polity in the church at that time. So that distinct three offices of bishop, priest, and deacon, as we understand them, it wasn't fully developed yet. You had both the term for priest and the term for bishop being used at the time, but who was sometimes a little bit fuzzy. And this doesn't mean that they were Presbyterian in their polity. That's the Presbyterians, that's what they concluded in the 17th century. That's not what that means. It just means things were still fuzzy in terms of polity at that time. And then this may be a local expression of the faith rather than a widely spread one. So the Didache may not be something that the entire church was looking at. It may have been something that a particular area, particular group of people were using this as one of their guides, and then it influences some of the stuff that is used more widely. Things like the Apostolic Constitutions, a later work that quotes from the Didache pretty extensively. The whole thing is not quite as long as the Sermon on the Mount. In Greek, it's about 2,300 words. For reference, my homilies are usually between about 1,800 and 2,500 words. In English, the Didache is about 3,000 words, so it's still not much longer than one of my normal Sunday homilies. Maybe like 5 minutes longer if you read it out loud. And the genre of the Didache, we call it a church order. What's a church order? Well, a church order is a discussion on moral conduct, on liturgy, and church organization. And most of the time, these early church orders were, we call this in literature, pseudo-epigraphic. What does that mean? It's using somebody else's name for authority. And in this case, the 12 apostles. Nobody thought that the 12 apostles authored the Didache, but it was issued in the name of the 12 apostles. Does that make sense? A lot of works in that second century, end of the first century, beginning of the second century are like that. That's a very common thing in those days. But we would also say that one of the reasons why we don't consider something like the Didache scriptural is because of that pseudo-epigraphic nature. Someone that's claiming to be Moses but isn't Moses, we're not going to say that's the word of God, right? It doesn't work that way, okay? For example, and we have a lot of that in the second century. Okay, what are the contents? And again, this was discovered in 1873, manuscript from 1056 or so. The monastery they found it in was in Constantinople, and this was just a huge thing for scholars at the time. Everybody went nuts because they thought this was lost for so long. Every now and again, this will happen in church archaeology. There'll be some seemingly lost document, and it just kind of takes the community, scholarly community by storm. But what we find is there's nothing in here that's that different from what we already had. This, it's a huge discovery, but it's not innovative. And that goes back to what we were talking about the last 2 weeks. Bob?
Since it was found in Constantinople, was there an immediate difference in interpretation between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Church?
Oh, in terms of this document, for the recording, it being found in Constantinople, was there a different interpretation in the West and the East, the Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholic world, the Protestant world? Not really. Everybody, as far as I know, kind of saw this pretty much the same. And one of the other things that we did see in it, I can't really speak to this firsthand, but everybody has said that is a scholar on this, that the style of Greek in this is a lot closer to the New Testament than to what the Greek church develops in the coming centuries. So this is not Byzantine Greek, this is Koine Greek. Most of what we have from the fathers is what we call Byzantine Greek. And I remember when Father Chris and I were in Greece last year, some of the writings in the frescoes and stuff were like, this doesn't look like Greek. This looks like Cyrillic or Russian. And our guide's like, oh no, that's just the Byzantine style of writing. Like, oh wow, that's something we didn't experience in seminary. So, but yeah, no, it was pretty much everybody kind of grabbed this and they're like, this is great. It should be studied. Nobody kind of fought over this. Yeah, you're welcome. And it was, of course, a Greek Orthodox monk who had it. It was in their monastery. Okay, let's talk about the contents, big picture overview, and then we'll get into the text itself for about 15 minutes. The first section is usually called the two ways, and the ways of life, the way of death. You see this in the chapter 1 subtitle here, two ways, the first commandment, right? And if you turn your page over, chapter 4 is, oh, nope, that doesn't come until later. We get to another one, which is the way of death. So we first have the way of life, then we have the way of death. And what you'll find in this is there's a lot of vice and virtue lists. You'll see these kinds of lists in Paul's letters quite a bit. So again, this is the kind of thing that we see even in the scripture genres, although this is organized differently. Some of those vice and virtue lists are basically paraphrases of what we find in the New Testament. It's also very reminiscent in this two ways thing of Deuteronomy, the wisdom literature of the wisdom literature of Proverbs. You're going to find this way of life, way of death thing is very Jewish wisdom literature, but also Deuteronomy. You'll remember in Deuteronomy, towards the end, Moses says there's a way of life, there's a way of death, and then they send half of Israel when they get into the Holy Land on one mountain to declare the blessings, and another half of Israel goes on the other mountain to declare the curses, illustrating that two ways. So that's the first part of the Didache, is the two ways, the way of life and the way of death. The next major section deals with ritual issues. We're going to find a very, very early discussion of baptism, very early discussion of communion. You're going to notice when we get into this communion, the communion passage, it's really fuzzy in its theology of communion. You don't have a developed Eucharistic theology there. And then a discussion of prayer and fasting and things like that. And then the third section is getting into polity issues. They're going to talk about the different offices of teachers, apostles, they're still using that term in those days, prophets as an office, bishops, deacons. It's going to talk about what it means to assemble on the Lord's Day and what it means for us as the church to wait for the second coming. So that's kind of the big picture of what we're going to talk about in the Didache. Thoughts, questions, comments before we move on to the text itself? Oh, hey, Zay. You're like out of my glasses peripheral.
So one of my questions about considering that we very recently, like started this copy, what is the textual versus like how many variants do you have, or how many different variations do you have in the theory at all? How much can we trust like this, like the original, like close to the original?
Okay, so for the recording, to just addressing issues of textual criticism issues regarding variants of manuscripts. How trustworthy is this translation, for example, it being pretty early? As far as I know, there's not very many textual variants because it is such a new discovery. And so my understanding from the little I've read on that part of things is that any modern scholarship resembles what we have here pretty closely. They may have some different word choices in their translation. You're going to find there's some pretty, I mean, this is 19th century writing, so there's some terminology that we just don't know today. I included some of those in footnotes in the handout because, frankly, there were some of those I had to look up. But in terms of the text itself, it's pretty. They're pretty sure. And my understanding is that manuscript from 1056, because of the way that it is linguistically, that very Koine Greek rather than Byzantine, they are pretty sure that it's a faithful copy of the original. That there hadn't been a lot of later editing, just because the style of Greek doesn't reflect later editing. Not my area of expertise, so I'll just defer to what I read on all that stuff. You're welcome. All right, well, let's get into the text. Chapter 1, the two ways, the first commandment. There are two ways, one of life and one of death, but a great difference between the two ways. The way of life then is this: first, you shall love God who made you. Second, your neighbor as yourself. And all things whatsoever you would should not occur to you, do not also do to another. And of these sayings, the teaching is this: bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what reward is there if you love those who love you? Do not also the Gentiles do the same? But love those who hate you, and you shall not have an enemy. Abstain from fleshly and worldly lusts. If someone gives you a blow upon your right cheek, turn to him also the other also, and you shall be perfect. If someone impresses you for 1 mile, go with him 2. If someone takes away your cloak, give him also your coat. If someone takes from you what is yours, ask it not back, for indeed you are not able. Give to everyone that asks you, and ask it not back, for the Father wills that to all should be given of your own blessings, that is, free gifts. Happy is he that gives according to the commandments, for he is guiltless. Woe to him that receives, for if one having need receives, he is guiltless. But he that receives not having need, he shall pay the penalty, why he received and for what. And coming into straits, that is confinement, he shall be examined concerning the things which he has done. He shall not escape thence until he paid back the last farthing. And that's a reference to Matthew 5:26. But also now concerning this, it has been said, let your alms sweat in your hands until you know to whom you shall give. What's this remind you of? Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, we're quoting directly from it, right? I mean, this is paraphrases and quotings from the Sermon on the Mount. Why do you think it might be in a church order like this? We're just going to grab from the Sermon on the Mount or something like that, plop it in there, and pass it out. Especially considering the historical context here, this late antiquity days. Why might that be so important?
Like kind of prayer, like summarizing like
Yeah, so for the recording, similar to the prayer book, summarizing those key things. Ben?
I was just gonna say, I think something else super practical, very like, it kind of just sums up like kind of the gist of like ministry, and that's kind of some of the most important stuff. The emphasis on ethics in the early church.
Yeah, so if you're going to go with ethics on the early church, where better than the Sermon on the Mount? It is a summary, a great summary of Jesus' teachings. Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of these things are exactly right. Jeff.
There wouldn't be that many scrolls in Matthew.
There's not that many scrolls of Matthew going around yet. That's absolutely right. Matthew at this point was maybe written 30 years before, uh, assuming an early date. And by the way, most scholars today do assume an earlier date for the Didache. When my edition was published, the scholars were still kind of hedging on a later date. But today, almost everybody agrees late first century, not early second century. And so, yeah, you've only got Matthew's gospel floating around for a few decades at this point. And so, does anybody have a copy of the New Testament sitting on their bookshelf at home? No, but you can get a 3,000 word, a 2,300 word letter. You can hang on to that. So yeah, that goes to what Zay was saying about similar to the prayer book, having those things there. Yeah, so that's all very important. What do you see in here as like some of the main concern? Anything kind of strike you as a little odd, even in that context? Zay.
so but I kind of like one rule say or we have like the Bible like one of this like this seems kind of like where it's like almost it seems like a few of the things that are said here are like that's also like kind of also like adding a little bit is like got to really know that one.
Yeah. So for the recording, notice that the way the golden rule is phrased is kind of backwards from the way that we got it in the gospel. Interestingly, the golden rule does not first show up in the Sermon on the Mount. It's actually a lot older than that. But all the older versions are in that negative form. So Jesus putting it in positively, do to others what you would have them do to you, that was kind of new. But the idea of don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you, that actually was floating around for centuries before. And Hillel, the Rabbi Hillel, he said it that way. There's a story of around the first century, or maybe like the generation or two before Jesus, there were two main rabbinic teachers in Jerusalem at the time, a guy named Hillel and a guy named Shammai, and they both had their own schools. This is just part of rabbinic studies. Everybody knows this in that world. And by and large, Shammai is seen as kind of the very conservative fuddy-duddy, whereas Hillel's kind of seen as a little bit more progressive, a little bit more permissive. And there's a story where a Gentile goes up to Shammai and says, hey, I will convert and follow your God if you can tell me the whole law while standing on one foot. And Shammai picks up his stick and chases him away, says, you're an idiot, get out of here. We don't want to, you're not taking the Lord seriously kind of thing. Beats him about the head, chases him out. Hillel, when he goes to Hillel stands up on one foot and says, gives the golden rule, only in that negative form, what you would not have, do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. And the guy converts. That's kind of one of those classic rabbinic stories. So yeah, that negative, that's different. And then there's a few things, as Isaiah said here, that it is taking the Sermon on the Mount, but it looks like it's adding a little bit to it, giving a little bit of icing on the cake for some reason. Let's look at an example of that. We have, from the Sermon on the Mount, give to everyone that asks you, et cetera, right? And then he says, woe to him that receives, for if one having need receives, he's guiltless, but he that receives not having need, he shall pay the penalty. Well, where's that come from? That's not in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, why do you think that it would have been important in that early Christian community to discourage unworthy reception? No, you're all good.
So I've heard that the idea behind that context is that you had traveling apostles, you had some random, basically trying to like make a movie off of like their ministry, just like your false, like why you trying to like you don't care about the gospel.
Yeah, you've got some grifters out there that are trying to make their money off of other people's generosity, and we're going to see this addressed directly in later chapters of the Didache. So this is one of the passages that address, or one of the books that talks about that. So evidently, that's a problem. Folks that come by, they're claiming to be teachers, prophets, apostles, asking for money. Then they're just kind of fleecing the flock. It's not about the poor. It's about people abusing the system. And later on, we're going to find that they specifically are targeting missionaries, prophets, teachers that are doing that. Do we see that today? Oh yeah, I mean this is nothing's new, right? Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. This is not a new thing, but there may have also been like you kind of hint at there, Brian. There may have been some folks that were. I mean, we see this in our community, don't we? Sometimes people that aren't actually in need, but they're taking advantage of generosity through begging. That happens, right? So, interestingly, well, and then this kind of speaks to that last bit. Let your alms sweat in your hands until you know to whom you should give. There should be some wisdom when you're doing your giving. Don't just randomly give. It's good to be generous. We should be generous, but we should use wisdom. Because we do want to have a responsibility over those things. So that should not discourage generosity, but it should encourage wisdom. Does that make sense? Yeah, and I'm sure when you're dealing with some of the mercy ministries here locally that you've seen some of that from time to time. But I think the big lesson that I would want to that struck me anyway is sometimes I'm a lot more keen to be wise than generous, and I'm not sure that's the right disposition either. You know what I'm saying? So we've talked about how there is that golden mean. Don't be foolhardy and don't be cowardly. That somewhere in the middle is proper courage, right? Courageousness. I think that's the same thing when it comes to this. Don't be miserly. Don't just throw around your money for the sake of it. Somewhere in the middle is proper Christian charity. Anything else on this first chapter? We're gonna pick up the rest of these chapters next week. Ben?
I would say overall, I think we see like a detachment from like possessions, just a detachment from like anything of the world, not anything of the world necessarily, but like not anything that connects you from like that world.
Yeah, part of the Christian ethic, especially in those early days, is detachment from worldly goods. And there was, so for example, the expectation would have been someone that's wealthy should be a lot more generous, right? I've heard this described when it comes to the principle of tithing that it'd be nice to get to the point where you're able to give a lot more than 10% because that's God giving you those blessings. But if He's giving you those blessings, let's be responsible with that. And that is the truth for a lot of ministries. It's folks that do that. you don't want to be grasping. So yeah, that's important. That's good observation, Ben. All right, well, I'll see you all in communion in service in a few minutes or next week, as the case may be. And we do have our annual meeting after the second service today. God bless.